Ms. Barker. Thank you so much for meeting with me today to discuss contract negotiations. So I just got a couple questions for you. My first question is, there was a 2020 AUA survey, and that revealed that nearly 68% of all urologists reported that they have the need to hire general urologists. So is this a statistic that makes the role of recruitment integral to the success of the incoming workforce and the medical group as a whole?
Thank you, Summer. Yes, absolutely. I would say the answer 100% is having a physician recruiter, either in-house that's employed by your organization, or you have resourced out an individual that can own and have 100% laser focus on uncovering candidates and owning that entire recruitment process will really alleviate a lot of stress and anxiety around the recruitment of a physician partner for your leadership and your physicians. So I've been doing physician recruiting for 16 years, and that is really a soup to nuts function. So a physician recruiter will cold call, identify candidates, create candidate summaries, and formally present them to their leadership. We also conduct phone interviews and set up your site visit experience and your site visit survey after the interview. We also work with contract negotiations and ultimately getting a physician onboarded and started on the right footing within a practice organization. So we take on that responsibility so the executives and the physician leadership know that behind the scenes, while they're doing everything they do within the practice, they know that all the while the recruiter is trying to uncover talent, assess fit, both clinically and culturally within the organization, and trying to find the best match for that practice.
So do you find the physician shortage to be this unfillable void in urology? And how are you or have you worked to reverse some of these statistics?
So I know the numbers can seem staggering, and I have some numbers here that at the recent LUGPA Resident Summit were shared at one of the presentations. 600 urologists retiring per year, with only 300 entering the workforce, an average age of 58, and one-third of the urologists 65 or older are planning to retire within 5 years. So you have a lot of daunting facts and statistics there to kind of digest. But I think what we are seeing is the pendulum shift from these more rigid concepts of how we used to deliver urologic care to communities and understanding that shortage presents the necessary option of how we deliver care going forward. And a lot of that might look like an outreach agreement or a telemedicine type arrangement with a group where, a community might not be able to necessarily attract a Monday through Friday, all day, every day urology physician. However, understanding that we can partner with different systems and communities and provide outreach agreements. It might not look like it has in generations past, but it still allows everybody the option of having care in that community to some capacity.
So one of the things that LUGPA does for residents is we sort of give residents this inside look at sort of recruitment and, human resources and finance and things like that. And I hope to, with this interview, really help residents to make really informed decisions, kind of having an inside view of how the inner workings of this whole thing works with a practice. So one of the things that residents are being told, or one of the rumors that are going around, is that they should be looking for employment as early as possible, even as early as like their first year. Is that true or not?
Yeah, actually, Summer, I would encourage that for residents, absolutely. I would advise them so long as they feel comfortable and confident in having those conversations. If they're not ready or they feel like they're ill prepared to have those conversations that early on, maybe just lean on your attendings or your program directors to help provide some additional education to where then you feel confident in starting those phone calls and interviews earlier on. But one of the best things that a resident can do for themselves is negotiate early. There are many benefits to signing with a group early. One of them being any kind of bonus compensation you might get with your contract. You could negotiate some of that money to be paid out while you're still in training. And while you're in training and you're making that extensively lower salary, you're under a lower tax bracket. So if you get any of the bonuses while you're a resident, the tax implication is much smaller than if you were to get that bonus as a practicing physician. You could negotiate stipends to be paid out during your residency. If you chose to move on to fellowship, you could have a fellowship stipend. There are lots of benefits to getting into the interview scene earlier rather than later, and just giving you a nice long trajectory of assessing your opportunities, weighing all of the options, giving those employers time to produce contracts and offers and revisions and edits and things that you come back with, and then ultimately giving yourself a nice long lead time for all of the things that can be kind of anxiety ridden when you finish your program. It's a lot of heavy lifts from a bunch of people in terms of onboarding, and you have to think of things like state licensure in the place where you intend to practice, hospital credentialing at all the places you will be ultimately providing coverage, clinic onboarding, which includes getting you credentialed with the insurances, and those move at a glacial pace nowadays. So like almost 6 to 9 months, if not longer, especially with like Medicaid and Medicare's. So allowing yourself that and understanding how long it just takes to onboard somebody once you actually get all the way through your interview time frame really will just make it that much more pleasant in terms of the timing and having you not feel so rushed.
So when you're recruiting or you're discussing, different things with a potential candidate, do you encourage an RVU-based compensation model? Is there a certain model you favor over the other?
Good question. So I have been a physician recruiter where I have been employed by a health system where the hospital had their own employment group of physician employed physicians. I've also been in a scenario where the hospital worked via what's called a recruitment agreement with private groups to help subsidize those specialties and that recruiting effort. And I've also recruited for academics, research, and now in the private equity arena. So I have seen all sorts of compensation models. I'll tell you there's positives to just about everyone, and there's negatives to just about everyone. RVU-based compensation is just one of, I would say, 6 or 8 different comp models that are fairly prevalent and popular right now within the industry. I've listed a few. You could have a straight salary year over year. You could have a salary based on net collections. You could have your salary based on RVUs or an eat what you heal, as we like to refer to. The more people you see, the more surgeries you do, the more money you make. There's also, with some of those different employment models, there's ancillary buy-ins and different ownership potential that allows you some additional a la carte compensation. There's group partnership tracks, there's private equity buy-ins, and lastly, like a shared bonus pool for all the partners across like a large group platform. So I wouldn't say there is one that's preferred over another, but just asking the good question of what the comp model looks like after any type of an initial guarantee period would be very important for a resident to understand. That's where you aren't comparing apples to apples necessarily. So really truly understanding what kind of model the group is in will help you determine which one feels best for you and assess what kind of contract you might like to move into when you're interviewing.
Okay. So when a resident is looking for a job, location is said to be one of the most important factors. There was a AUA study in 2009 that showed that urologists younger than 45 years old were 3 times less likely to be located in a non-metro um, slash rural county than their older counterparts. Why do you believe that younger urologists want to work in a more urban area? And have you worked to assist with getting younger practitioners to underserved areas?
Absolutely. I think we as a younger generation are much more mobile than our predecessors. And with that, I think nowadays residents in their family unit, however that might be comprised, are making a collective decision, not just on the medical offering within that community and what type of urologic partnership they might have there, but from a cultural standpoint. So I love the fact that the diversity that we have coming out of our residency programs has come a long way in the last several decades. And with that comes a different set of expectations where our residents are craving more than just another urology partner. And I don't want to um, make that sound bad, but we're also assessing fit both from an academic setting for families and children, like schools, universities, um, religious affiliations, cuisine, if you've got a different type of family that's looking for a special type of international market, or restaurant offerings, or just exposure to that. Um, Intangible hobbies and things that you might not find necessarily in a rural community. So, outside of that, physicians are also looking to partner with great systems that have good partners within other subspecialties. So they're assessing their interventional radiology group, the anesthesia group. Do they have a robot there on site? So it becomes a much broader sales pitch and broader picture for the recruiter who is trying to help that physician determine if that's the best fit for them in that location, just based on so many factors. So I think nowadays physicians are looking for more of those boxes to be checked. However, if you are a resident and you have a passion for serving an underserved area, there are absolutely government websites that you should initially look into first before doing a lot of other research that might take you down some dead ends, where you would have identified an underserved area with some acronyms using a MUA site, an MUA, or a medically underserved area, a HIPSA, which is a health professional shortage area, or a HRSA, a health resource shortage area, and FQHC, a federally qualified health system. So these government websites and government reports have federally funded and grants tied to them that offer additional monetary relief for a physician who might want to serve those communities. So long as you know what type of population you're serving and you go into it answering those questions and knowing kind of what to expect, I think you would definitely have the opportunity to both find super urban options and underserved areas for whatever you're looking for in your career goals.
So along those same lines of diversity, you talked a little bit about the benefit for the practice to have a diverse group of physicians. How does having a diverse group of urologists to serve a large population benefit the patients?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love some of these stories where I find after I've recruited a physician that they have connected with either a patient or somebody within the practice that has um, similar thoughts and feelings towards any type of diverse characteristic or attribute, whether it's somebody's home country or their cultural or religious beliefs or languages spoken or hobbies or so on and so forth. So I love it in that we can market that if we have those conversations and we find out some of these niche areas that physicians might be passionate about or be culturally connected to or have a little bit of diversity in those interests. You would be surprised what type of organic growth you would get from like a referral standpoint. And I have a great story. One time I recruited a physician who was of Indian descent. She was first generation Indian, and she went to medical school in Russia. She could not get into a medical program in her home country and was able to get into Russia and learned complete medical Russian within several years and was able to complete her medical degree in a Russian program. So she comes out, she moves to Ohio, and we uncover this Russian population within this demographic, and we see this marketable option, and the families just starting to come in troves because word of mouth has now gotten around that this wonderful practitioner speaks fluent Russian and can serve that community. So that's just like a wonderful example of how that can really play into a wonderful partnership when you talk through those things and you find out how you might be able to use that diversity to benefit that physician and their trajectory to success in the practice.
That's awesome. So do you participate in any minority recruitment programs, say for women or people of color?
Yes, absolutely. So right now I am partnered with the Society for Women in Urology. I hope to provide more outreach to other minority programs, but especially with the female demographic and more of the female urologists coming into medicine, allowing them just to understand and have the wherewithal to ask really intentional questions that we as females deem really important. Some of those are a maternity clause or a short-term disability clause, the opportunity for job share or telemedicine or outreach programs. So some of those things that might have otherwise been frowned upon with some of the older guard is really important to this next phase in residents coming out of programs and having the confidence to ask those questions and not feel like you're being shut down. So part of that outreach is just normalizing those conversations and helping our older generations understand that that is the new wave and the future of medicine, and how can we accommodate those minority programs.
Excellent. So what are some resources that a resident could use to start to decide if he or she should enter private practice, academic urology, employed, private equity, etc.?
Absolutely. So I think one of my most passionate things is resident education around those exact concepts. What type of employment platform is most suited for me or for, physician A or B? And part of that is the exposure to that during your training program. So I would always encourage residents to go to their program directors or the chief over that urology program and ask them to uncover educational sessions that might allow for exposure to those different employment models. I always hear that residents lean on their attendings and can ask them about different employment models, but I always say take that with a grain of salt. A lot of those individuals, while they have great resources and can give you a lot of information, they've been in their career for years, they might not have a lot of exposure to different career models. They might have had their entire career within academics, and they might not have new up-to-date information on, let's say, what a private equity model looks like or what a private LUGPA practice might look like operationally. So I always say make a list of what you are looking for, see how that compares to the different employment models, and ask your program to provide you with education that might help you uncover the differences of each platform model.
In your opinion, are there a set of skills that a person coming out of residency should have under their belt to sort of give them a leg up when negotiating a contract?
For sure. And this dovetails nicely into the previous question. One of the things I think we can all do better on is preparing our residents to start to negotiate their own salaries. Um, Part of it is knowing the things to ask and having education around just the business acumen and the language, the acronyms that are used within like a contract negotiation, just understanding some of those words that are so freely shared within the recruitment world and the business world aren't necessarily shared with residents. And we can lose them very quickly. And it's really concerning for me in that we have these great clinical programs and then we expect them to negotiate these large contracts with not a lot of education behind it. We kind of leave them with a wing and a prayer that they've done their best effort on for themselves, and part of my goal is to, um, promote this sense of confidence and the wherewithal to ask the difficult questions and know that no question is off the table. I mean, this is your time to answer or get answered all of the questions that you have down to the minutia. And it can seem exhausting, but this is your life. This is your career. And I want every resident to go in feeling really confident about the decision that they've made and not, look back after 2 years of employment and feel like you've had smoke and mirrors presented to you, or a different set of assumptions were made, or maybe some handshake deals that went awry. So I think just having the business exposure during training will set you up for success, and leaning on either an in-house recruiter within your academic institution. So a lot of the hospitals actually have an in-house recruiter. Ask them to come and talk to your cohort about the different types of employment or contract templates or what a process looks like for the recruitment, just to get them started in those conversations and have them kind of pull themselves out of their clinical mindset and put their business cap on and start to think of how they might promote and present themselves from that side of things.
Great. So, so let's say the resident or now candidate, they've been through the interview recruitment process and they've signed the contract and they begin their employment. How often do you think that they should be encouraged to renegotiate the renegotiable aspects of their contract? Is that built into the contract?
Gotcha. Okay. So while a lot of contracts aren't necessarily renegotiated per se, um, they usually have evergreen renewal terms to them. A lot of times they'll have like a 2-year initial employment terms with options for yearly renewals thereafter. And those renewals kind of come up and go and get renewed without a lot of pomp and circumstance around them. There's not a big sit down at a table with a bunch of lawyers to try to renegotiate a salary. There are parts and pieces to a contract that might lend itself to the ability to have it be renegotiated. Let's say there might be the potential for new outreach agreements with different outlier communities. So there's a lot of verbiage out there, and again, leaning on your recruiter would be helpful in this aspect, but they use terminology that would include things like mutually in good faith, or with prior agreement from all parties. This is some of the wording that you could write into a contract that would allow you to have as much skin in the game as your employer. So when and if there were renegotiated terms or something, a new opportunity came up, that would allow you the option to be a part of those discussions before you would commit to anything. Kind of keeps your employer on the straight and narrow to where they couldn't necessarily dictate where you might go without your say so.
So is a candidate who has had fellowship training considered more valuable than one who has not? Why or why not?
So I wouldn't say they're any more valuable than a physician coming out with the general urology residency. Um, while there might be great marketing opportunities for a physician with a fellowship where we could actually go on our website and say, Audrey Barker is fellowship trained in uro-oncology and provides these, you know, more difficult procedures or does the more difficult oncologic cases. That's one thing that we could do. However, I think with residents who are going on to fellowship, they have to understand that when they start out, we are just trying to get them to build their practice. Those first several years, it might seem like it's very slow paced and you're going to be hungry to see patients. You're going to be hungry to build your patient platform and your book of business, if you will. And during that time, while you're under what they call a guarantee period, where your employer is paying for your salary, you don't want to limit yourself and come in and kind of say, you know, I'm only going to see this type of patient, because that's going to really slow down your trajectory to get ramped up and ultimately move towards a partnership track. So I think at least in the first 1 to 3 years of employment with a group, be open to seeing general, be open to seeing everything. Get your base of patients built up. And then once you're outside of that initial guarantee period, you could really start to develop your niche within a practice. You're going to need to have those years to develop your sea legs anyway. And just exposing yourself to everything and rounding out all of that training that you've had will really help you in the long run develop that niche. A lot of the niche practices that coincide with fellowships come from taking care of patients in a general urologic type atmosphere, but then transitioning them to a more specialized or your fellowship training type program. So I think at least I would advise be open to doing some general in the beginning and then moving on to what you've done in fellowship thereafter, after you've completed a couple years under your belt.
With contract negotiations and just thinking about, like, you know, taking a holistic approach to it, is work-life balance or burnout, is that dealt with in the contract negotiation phase these days?
Sure. I think it is to some extent. Definitely the work-life balance comes up in conversation when you are talking about your call burden, what your call pod might look like, how many calls you're getting a night, how often you're having to go into a hospital, your outreach agreements, how often you're being expected to travel and serve another community outside of your primary population. Clinic schedule, how many patients a day, when you start, when you finish, are you taking a lunch and giving yourself time, or are you working right through and finishing early? So those all kind of lend themselves to just the burden itself of work-life balance. However, burnout, I think we're hearing it a lot more. We're talking about it now with emotional health and our mental health, and especially within the physician population, burnout and mental health is so important. And having that awareness and normalizing those conversations is really a goal, I think, across the country to see how we can uncover opportunities to support those conversations and support any of those prevention efforts. So I think I would encourage residents to ask about any kind of division or department within that organization that specifically works to discuss burnout or alleviate burnout. What's the culture within the practice? Knowing that that would be important to you and going to that group and asking them what their process is, how they deal with that. I think it goes a long way to show them that that's an important piece and aspect of your decision making when you are interviewing, and that they would need to take that seriously and hopefully discuss that and show the wherewithal of ways that they prevent burnout within the organization. How they answer that question might be important for you to hear and see as well while you're interviewing. If they kind of naysay it and they say, oh, we, you know, or make a joke or kind of blow it off, that might be the answer that you need to, that cautionary flag of whether they take it seriously, whether it's an ideal or a concept or a principle that they know about and they're acknowledging and embracing it or not.
So let's say there's a first year resident who's asked, what are you thinking about doing after residency? Because you say, you should probably be thinking about it earlier than most people say. What if they say, if they're talking about solo practice, subspecialty, large urology group, they say, you know what, doesn't matter where I end up. I just want to go wherever I can make the most money. What would you say to that first year resident?
So I would say, great. You know where you want to go and you have your goals. Let's do it. I don't want to say that's off-putting by any means, because everybody's going to have their own personal goals for where they want to go after they practice. While the person we're mentioning in this example might be financially motivated to eliminate debt as quickly as possible, another resident might have, pie in the sky aspirations to be employed by Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or Johns Hopkins, and they might like that notoriety with the name, and that might be their motivator, and they might be willing to take a less of a salary because they want that notoriety of having the name with their employer. Others might have different desires and aspirations. So whatever the case may be, whatever a resident's main goals are right then, I think as a first year resident, that might ebb and flow, and you might have a change in thought philosophy about how and where you want to practice. But at least understanding that if you were motivated by money and you wanted that large salary right from the jump as soon as you started, just understanding some of the requirements, responsibilities that come with that. Oftentimes an employer that has to pay that much in an initial salary, that might go against the typical norms and standards of like a typical fair market value survey. They might be more rural and they might have to pay more to attract those physicians. And that might constitute a higher call burden, or less vacation, or less partners, and less mentorship opportunities. So at least, by asking those questions and know what you're getting into, I would say go for it. Whatever your personal goals are, I wouldn't want anybody to be shamed for whatever motivates them in their career choices.
So do you think that a new hire should always plan to stick with the same employer for a set number of years, or, receive a certain amount of on-the-job education before moving to another employer?
Good question. So a lot of times, very, very, very often, a contract will have an initial term for 1 or 2 years, let's say. So while you're getting ramped up, you are under a 1 or 2 year guarantee period where the employer pays your salary. After that, you would move into like a partnership tract or something like that. However, while you are negotiating your contract, you will often have bonus money that you have negotiated and incorporated into your compensation package. A lot of times, the bonus money that you will receive will have a much longer forgiveness period than a 2-year initial contract term. For example, your 2-year initial term for employment is great. However, they've paid you, let's say, $100,000, and that forgiveness period says that that physician has to be employed with us for 4 years before that's fully forgiven. And that's fine. So, and that's very common. So I would just encourage a resident to look and differentiate between what their initial employment term is and what their forgiveness term is for any type of bonus money that they might be receiving. And then if they can make the decision whether they want to stay with a practice or not, it might come down to how close they are to having that bonus forgiven. Let's say they're 6 months from having their full bonus forgiven. They might choose to stay on those last 6 months and have zero obligation back to that employer. Now, that is with a caveat, because I always encourage the residents and physicians to know and understand that they have negotiating power when and if they want to move on from whatever employer they're at now. they could go to their next employer and say, listen, Summer, I owe $50,000 to my previous employer. I haven't yet fulfilled my forgiveness obligation. Would you be able to help me with that? And I would say 99 times out of 100, again, they have limitless options, these residents and physicians. And if you're interviewing with a group, they clearly want you. And we would make every effort to somehow help alleviate that financial requirement back to your previous employer. And that can often be a bonus with your next employer group. They might pay you a bonus that completely fulfills whatever financial obligation you owe back to your previous group. So there's a lot of tips and tricks on how to negotiate that, but understanding that you're not tethered or married in perpetuity to an organization, there is flexibility there. A lot of times the language feels daunting and very long-term and scary, but understanding your outs and what obligations you have, it makes it a little bit more manageable when you're talking through those negotiations.
So when considering candidacy, should a young urologist be thinking about or have an ideal retirement plan?
Yeah, so I liken this to buying a home. So I've bought a couple homes, and the realtor seems to always be talking to me about the resale value of a home that I haven't even bought yet. And I feel like that feels a lot like retirement. We haven't even started in practice. We're still training, and yet they're talking to me about retirement and what that looks like. But you have put in so much time and so much effort and so much money into preparing yourself for this great career. You would be doing yourself a disservice if you weren't thinking of the things you want to do and aspire to in retirement. And you want your retirement to be fruitful and long lasting and affording yourself these great travel options or whatever the case may be. So early on, even as you start, as you're talking with all of the general benefits that should always be offered to you through like an HR benefits package, you want to understand and have access to what the match is with like a 401k or a 403b. And understanding the differences of those. Depending on your employer, you're going to have one of those or the other. There's also what's called a buy-up plan once you get to a certain age where you can have an additional retirement platform to put in additional monies towards retirement savings. What the vesting is, how long you have to be employed with an organization before your contribution is matched by the employer. What the match is. Do they pay 25% on the dollar or 50%? That might tell you what your threshold of contribution would be, so you're taking full advantage of the vesting option. And then I always encourage residents of anything that you might pay money out to, having an accountant or a CPA help you manage those things. It's a lot of times like a sports athlete or an NFL player, and you get this windfall of money all of a sudden, and you're pie in the sky, and you have these desires to really kind of live high on the hog and enjoy all the fruits of your labor that you've finally had come to fruition. But being financially responsible and prudent and setting yourself up for a really nice retirement is really important as well.
Another surprising statistic that the AUA survey from 2020 revealed is that only 23% of current practices anticipate hiring at least one urologist. And with such a staggering shortage as you spoke about, and the stats for the future not being so good, why aren't more practices looking to hire? Is revenue and budget ultimately the most important factor that they're considering?
To answer the first question, it's my opinion that, again, older generations, we had a lot of mom and pop practices that were solo practitioners. I call them the Norman Rockwell generation, where they just served the community differently. And we have definitely seen that pendulum shift in the baby boomers consolidating practices. So they've gone from 3 groups or 5 groups down to one larger group. So that might play into those numbers and statistics a little bit. Also, those private groups being bought out by either large health systems and becoming hospital employed platforms, or private equity, in my case, or again, they've merged and acquired or partnered with each other. So I think there's some consolidation there where that percentage might lend itself to maybe a potentially larger group, whereas before a larger statistic might have been likened back to like a lot of smaller practices. So I think that might have something to do with those numbers. And again, might be respective to the region on how they might provide care, where a system might say, you know, after Audrey finishes her career and she leaves, we will likely move towards an outreach agreement with a larger system out of town or a larger group out of town and provide some sort of coverage arrangement with a different practice altogether. So I think that might be some of the reasons why we see that number, or that percentage rather. The revenue and budget, it shouldn't be the end all be all on why a group is recruiting. So something for a resident to ask as they're interviewing is to the employer, have you completed a pro forma, a practice pro forma, or a succession plan survey, so you can identify future retirements and what your growth needs are and the strategic plan of the organization. They should go in fully aware of where their needs are and why they're recruiting, or why they have 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 open slots for urology physicians to come in. So ask those hard questions, make sure they've done their due diligence and can articulate to you why they're recruiting and where the needs are. Has a physician left? And if so, why? Is a physician retiring? And if so, great. Can I be the person that does the warm handshake and the warm handoff with that retiring physician, and essentially be adopting and taking on a full patient panel when that physician ultimately would retire? So a lot of those financial decisions have already been discussed and already baked into a recruitment effort. And I like to say that it takes a village to recruit a physician and get them ramped up and happy and acclimated and rooted into a practice. It takes so much financial lift as well to bring you in. If we do you a disservice and we don't have the wherewithal to provide you with the support that will make you successful after that guarantee period, and I'm talking about outreach and marketing and revenue cycle and IT and your EMR system and all of those things, operational things. That's your community around you. And while you're interviewing, ask yourself if that potential employer has exposed you to those resources and those individuals that would ultimately be the ones that will help you get through the trying times. So it's a big lift. Everybody's got skin in the game. It would be a huge effort to bring somebody in only to lose them after a couple of years because we haven't provided them with all the resources they needed to be successful. So just reviewing an interview itinerary, making sure that you're talking to all of those key columns of where you might find help, where you need it from like an operational standpoint, clinic standpoint, coding, all of those things. So again, having the knowledge and the wherewithal to ask those questions, and then the confidence to kind of dig in a little deeper and make sure you're getting the answers that you want. I also encourage residents to ask the same question to multiple people. That might sound like it's not really beneficial for your interview day, but I think everybody's going to have different spins on the answers that they give you, and that might be really telling of an organization as well. But then ultimately you'll land on your own concept of all of the answers and what you gathered from all those folks that you spoke to, and you can weigh those answers and decide whether that's going to be an opportunity that you want to move forward with.
And lastly, what about your role at US Urology Partners do you find the most rewarding?
Yeah. So I have been the Vice President of Physician Recruitment for US Urology Partners for 2 years now. And before this, I was with a very large health system that had 23 residency programs, over 300 residents. And part of the love that I had in my previous career with that system was the baked in intentional business rotation that our residents had through the recruitment department. So whether a resident was going to sign with us or not, that wasn't the goal. The goal for our recruitment department was to expose the residents to different contracts that they might encounter, to different business language that they needed to know about, how to negotiate, how to ask the bad questions, not bad questions, but difficult questions. One of them, again, might be salary. And I think one of the questions was when to ask about salary. And it's, you can ask about it. Don't make that be your very first question, but you can lean on your recruiter and say, hey, when is appropriate to ask about compensation? That is a much better palatable segue into that discussion than right off the rip saying, so how much does this pay? So I love when residents lean on me for exposure to the process, the look behind the curtain, to use your term, Summer. What all are we doing behind the scenes that the residents don't know about? And how can we uncover ways to just advocate for themselves, be confident in the questions, know that these questions have been asked a million times, that there's no bad questions. I think during residency, a lot of times residents are kind of these meek little creatures that tend to not ask questions unless they are asked a question of, or, don't put the spotlight on me, I'm just here to learn. And then we expect them to just flip the script all of a sudden and be these great business people. And I think we're doing a disservice not exposing them to more business acumen during their training. And if I can provide a little glimpse of that, it fills my cup every day. Over the last 16 years, the process really hasn't changed. Private equity is kind of new out there, and that's the new fancy thing that's going on within the urology arena now. But they're still hospital employed. There's still solo practice. There's still LUGPA practices. The comp models, morph and change a little bit, but the process for the most part isn't that much different. But every resident is different, and their goals are different, and their personal story is different. And I love hearing about that. And I think all of the recruiters that you're going to talk to are these great relationship builders, and the long play that you have with a recruit, like I just encouraged residents that are in PGY2 to start interviewing. So that would be me talking to a potential 2026 candidate, right? So it's a very long play, and we make these great relationships, and I call them my little birds, and we see them through this long process, and the long game is years, years and years, and then to finally see it come to fruition and have there be a successful result of all of those efforts really fills my cup, and I have enjoyed doing it for 16 years, and I hope to do it for another 16.
Audrey, thank you so much. That was such valuable information, and I can tell you really love what you do. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. This was such valuable information.
My pleasure, Summer. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was my pleasure.